here is the Peggy Martin that had a really hard reset over the winter, or actually last fall. And somebody asked a question recently wondering, with the fact that Peggy Martin only blooms once a year, is it still worth growing? And my answer is yes, because when I compare the value or the real estate value of a plant in the garden, bloom period and bloom length are both part of it, but the other factor that I consider is the maintenance involved to keeping that plant maintained and healthy throughout the year. So the rule of thumb here is, if you want your Peggy Martin to be worth having and not become just an insane demand of work that's not giving you back anything, it must be planted in the absolute right place with the perfect conditions. Because if you plant this rose in a place that it's not getting enough sunlight, it's going to just turn into an ugly, winding, just floppy mess. So this is a perfect example of what happens when a Peggy Martin is planted without a plan. I'm not sure what the goal was here, but this fence over here, the neighbor does not want it on the other side, so that's not an option. There's a ligustrum planted a foot from it to the left, and then there's a Mexican sage planted right to the right, and there's an apple tree right after that. There's a rose bush here. This right here, I'm standing about 15 feet from where the Peggy Martin is planted. Martin, you've got to account for Peggy Martin to do its thing, 15 feet in each direction, and then something to support that. But you've got to have an upper area that gets full sun, that doesn't compete with other plants, to actually enjoy the blooms that it's going to produce with the minimal amount of maintenance, because there is nowhere for this plant to support itself or be supported and then produce blooms in a shape or fashion that's anything, to me, anything worth really having. So if you plant your Peggy Martin without a plan, you're going to end up with a big floppy mess of competition and a mix-up cluster of plants growing inside of each other, and this extremely high maintenance situation. I mean, this one I'm even further. This one's about 20 feet from where the Peggy Martin is planted. If you don't have your plan or dedicated area all set up in place for how you're going to train this Peggy Martin to go with a proper support system so it can actually grow and display itself, you don't know what kind of maintenance you're setting yourself up for, and it's really just not an enjoyable plant to have. So that is the key difference. And if you're wondering, is it worth having because it blooms once a year? If it's trained in the proper conditions and set up with the proper place to grow in, that it's getting all the conditions that it likes, such as full sunlight, the proper irrigation, air, and support, then heck yeah, it's definitely worth having. But if you're not taking into consideration all of those things before you plant Peggy Martin, it's definitely not worth it, because this is not worth it. This isn't anything but work. It is work year round, and we're not getting much out of the one time that it does bloom. And the plan of having it against the wall is it only requires about 2 times a year maintenance, and then the heavy reset is only once every 2 years. That's not even every year. Okay, so when it comes to the canes at the bottom, there's a couple things that I've already been able to narrow down about which ones I'm going to keep and which ones I'm going to get rid of, because there's 3 new canes coming up. Normally, if I had started this Peggy Martin and training it from the very beginning, I would already have the canes that I feel like are best for this entire growth structure. However, I was working with what I had, trying to make the best of an already tangled up mess of a Peggy Martin. If I was sure all the ones that I want up here are exactly how I want them and perfect and already in place, and I didn't want anything different, I would never let those canes at the bottom grow out. I would keep them clean. But since I just reset it, there's a lot of energy of this plant wanting to put out growth, and so I'm just going to see if there's any better options for some straight, more structured canes, because what I'm doing right here is I'm going to let some of these canes get a little longer and decide if I want to remove any of these older ones and let some of these newer ones take their place to have it more snug against the wall, because I do think the effect is better when it can stay snug against the wall. If you have it set up in a proper support and place to do its thing, and you give it the space it needs in the right conditions, when it blooms, it is stunning, and the maintenance can be reduced to once or twice a year. So again, the proper planning is what determines if Peggy Martin is worth having or not. When I get to the point where I'm going to swap out canes or change out canes for, change out my least favorite canes for some better canes, I will have a video for that. So just remember, all these Peggy Martin progress videos, I'm going to put in a playlist of their own, because there are so many different strategies and care things that go into Peggy Martin, and I get so many questions that I'm just going to try to put them all in one place, so that way anybody who's interested in learning more about growing a Peggy Martin, or who has a question about the care for Peggy Martin that they might already have, hopefully you can find it in there. And if not, please be sure to leave a comment letting me know any questions you have, because I really want to encourage people to have a more successful garden and be able to enjoy the plants that they have.